There are a lot of people who are interested in complex systems and planning. And what they're doing is computational modeling. And so they're simulating an environment and they're, giving the agents in the computer model simple rules and they're watching patterns emerge. I think the work is interesting, but I'm much more interested in let's make systems that inherently build in that adaptive capacity. Do the agents in the system have enough degrees of freedom where they have adaptive capacity? If I build something that can only be deployed in one way, then I'm limiting what it can do 10 months from now, 10 years from now, in terms of the environment it's finding itself with, the context it's finding itself within. How can I deploy something which I don't know how it's ultimately going to manifest itself, but has an inherent designed capacity to manifest itself in different ways? That changes your design problem considerably.
Welcome to the Work for Humans podcast. This is Dart Lindsley. The Grand Bazaar in Istanbul is one of the oldest multi-sided enterprises in the world. It was founded in the 15th century, and it has thrived with very little central governance for more than half a millennium, from the Middle Ages to the modern day. How and what can businesses learn from how the Grand Bazaar has managed to adapt over time? Dr. Sharon Wohl has built a career studying the overlap between urban design and complex adaptive systems, and she picked the Grand Bazaar as the perfect model to study how such bottoms-up systems adapt to change. Sharon is the Associate Dean for the College of Architecture and Environmental Design at Kent State University. She's been published in the journals Planning Theory, Progress in Human Geography, and Space and Culture. Her excellence has been recognized with research and architecture fellowships at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Amsterdam and Iowa State University. In this episode, Sharon and I talk about the emergent properties of the Grand Bazaar, complex adaptive systems in decentralized settings, and whether or not we need overarching governance to create great experiences of work. We also discuss how simple rules can lead to complex results, bottom-up strategies for system design and urbanism, the way designers can enable thriving systems, and other topics. As always, thank you for supporting Work for Humans, and be sure to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And now, without further ado, my conversation with Dr. Sharon Wohl. Welcome, Sharon Wohl, to Work for Humans.
Well, thank you, Dart. It's lovely to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
So, the way I first came across your work, as people who listen to this show routinely know, is that we are exploring a lot the idea that all companies are multi-sided businesses and that employees form one side of the business. And so one of the oldest multi-sided businesses in the world is the Grand Bazaar in Turkey, in Istanbul. And so I started looking for people who might be experts on the Grand Bazaar, and I found your work, and in particular, the fact that you were applying complex adaptive systems ideas, close to my heart, to the Grand Bazaar. And of course, that's irresistible. So I started reading your work. Thank you for agreeing to come on the show. That's what I want to explore today. Why did you start looking at the Grand Bazaar at all? How did that come to be?
I guess the answer has many different facets to it, some of which are personal and some of which have to do more with my research. So I had traveled to Turkey on numerous occasions, and I had really fallen in love with the country and just found it so intriguing. I also just found life on the streets there so amazing compared to North American cities. So my background is in architecture, but I study urban design, urban planning, and one of the things I'd always been interested in is why are North American cities so deadened in many ways? You know, you go to business districts in downtown cities in the United States or in Canada, and you have a lot of very vacuous places that have no life. And you go to places in Europe and there are so many people on the street, so much activity happening, so much vibrancy. So I was interested in cities that have a live character to them and trying to uncover what makes cities tick, which is kind of what brought me to complex adaptive systems, because I was interested in trying to learn what I could from natural systems that had an alive quality to them and how they function. So that was a little bit of the background. I did a lot of preliminary research in systems that were more about relations than were about physical attributes of architecture. And I eventually came to complexity thinking as a good tool to start to think about these systems. And when I did that, I was looking for an example of something where I could see emergent structure that seemed to create patterns that weren't controlled from the top down. So I had been working in an architecture firm in Canada. We were doing a lot of master planning, and the typical way that you generate urban plans is you do a bunch of drawings and you have sort of an end plan in mind for how things are going to look, and then you try to structure that environment to turn out that way. And these sort of top-down master planning strategies seemed to very seldom align with what actually was happening on the ground. And so my interest was in seeing, could you have meaningful functional patterns that emerged without this sort of top-down planning strategy in place? And what I recognized about the Grand Bazaar was that it was a thriving area. There's 4,000 shops in the Grand Bazaar, and it has been able to sustain itself for over 500 years. And so how is that happening? How in this sort of this times of constant change and transformation is it able to sustain itself? And at some point, I came across a map of the bazaar that was showing the districts of the bazaar and what was sold there at one point in time, and another map that sort of showed the same overall plan, but with different districts of goods that were manifesting about 50 years later. And my interest was in, all right, well, how do these patterns of contiguous districts form when there isn't any top-down planning happening in the bazaar? And I really wanted to study that. I was really curious about the mechanisms behind what was allowing that to occur.
How did the bazaar start? And a part of what I understand is who owns it. But how did it start?
So that's interesting. And I want to say as well, in order to do this research, I had to learn a little bit about the history of the Grand Bazaar, but I wouldn't call myself a historian by any sense. I'm really an urban design thinker and an architecture practitioner. And so I did learn some history of the Grand Bazaar, but I may get some things not exactly accurate. My understanding of the bazaar is that really it was part of a larger complex that was related to the mosque. And in every neighborhood, you would have a kind of a religious backdrop of the mosque, and that would take care of a lot of provisions for the public good. So some of that was that there was schools, there was charitable foundations, so people would give a portion of their income to the mosque, and then that would be distributed in terms of food for people who were in need, but that there was also a commercial enterprise that was associated with that, so that the mosque would own a commercial venture and then collect rent from that. And some of the rent that was collected would then in turn help offset the costs of operating the mosque complex and its other sort of charitable entities associated with that. So historically, that was how the bazaar was started, and how, you have these beautiful, the covered market in Istanbul is absolutely beautiful. And so some of that was constructed as part of the mosque complex, but it grew over time and it transformed over time. And at this point, it's not owned by a single entity. So I think there are private individuals who have over time bought shops in the bazaar, and they will either rent those out or the shopkeepers themselves will buy them over time as they become successful.
So the Grand Bazaar started as almost like a social enterprise. It was something that was started by religious organizations for the community. It sounds like, from what I was reading in your work, like it was started as something that would be good for everybody.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, as I said, without being a deep historian into the origins, I think that it was a very strategic move to say, well, people are going to need goods anyway, so why don't we sort of incorporate this as part of a broader social enterprise and seeing these things as being integrated in a way that you are covering the full life cycle from people's religions to people's needs to care to the idea of education. So, yeah, it was part of a broader enterprise.
Here are two big questions, which we'll have to probably answer in sequence. The first one is, what are complex adaptive systems? And a part of the challenge with even the phrase is that as soon as people hear it, they hear complex. That sounds complex. Is it going to be hard? And then what does it bring to a problem like urban design or urban planning that other methods don't bring?
Great questions. So, first of all, what is a complex adaptive system? And I agree with you. In some ways, I find the word complex alienates people from talking about these systems. But really, I think what it is that the systems, they have nonlinear aspects to them. So instead of simple cause and effect types of relationships that we're used to studying, the relationships have a different kind of complexity to them. But it doesn't mean that they're necessarily that complicated. It just means that there's another underlying dynamic. So an example that I like to use and that sort of helps illustrate what a complex system is we've all seen, either directly or indirectly, the idea of ants that form trails when they're looking for food, right? And so you see an ant trail, and that is a very organized structure. But how did that structure come to be? There are no planners or master ants who are directing that pathway. Instead, the pathway is gradually emerging over time. And so the dynamics by which that pathway emerges is the result of interactions between these individual agents within the system, which are the ants. And because of various feedback mechanisms and pheromones that ants leave, we wind up having something that appears very structured, that is the outcome of the actions of numerous individual agents, but that is yielded through processes that we can't really say are following a direct line of A causes B, B causes C, C causes D, because instead you might have 1,000 ants that are interacting, and it is all these minute interactions happening adjacent to one another that is gradually causing the information in that system to be steered in such a way that we find a structure emerging.
About a complex adaptive system, I'm going to just start saying CAS, which is the easier thing to say. We don't have to say complex over and over again and keep making everybody feel like it's super complex.
Right.
So CAS, complex adaptive systems. They're made up of a bunch of agents who are acting independently without overarching governance necessarily, but who often with very simple rules are able to do very complex things. And I seem to remember hearing that ants form bridges across rivers with one simple rule. If another ant is standing on my head, stop moving. And so with that simple rule, if I get to the edge of the water and I'm sort of feeling the edge of the water, and then another ant climbs on my head, I stop, and then I become a bridge.
Right. It's amazing how such simple rules can really generate very, very complex structures. And it's the same thing when you see, starling murmurations. That's another example, or schools of fish and how they move together. It's not as though they've got really sophisticated programming going on to make these forms happen. They are just following a few very, very easy rules. And they've been able to show the kinds of rules that we suspect they are by running computer models that exhibit the same kind of forms that we see in those natural systems.
So what happens is we look from a distance and we say, look, a starling murmuration, or we say, look, an ant path, and we see the structure of the byproduct of those rules. And cities are one of those things. There's a bunch of rules that work together that form very complex, very successful, and if you're running a business, very profitable things. But there's this question that I want to explore throughout all of this, which is I'm running a company, and I feel like I should be doing something to make that company successful. Just like an urban planner says, I'm an urban planner. I should be doing something to make this successful. But the very idea of emergence is that it happens from below. it happens because the agents are following rules. And many of the attempts to come from above with a plan are completely defeated by the emergent properties of all the agents following rule. And the reason that the bazaar is so interesting is that it's survived. It's survived for half a millennium as something that is not necessarily strictly governed from above. So, are there rules that are coming from above that are making the bazaar work? And then let's talk about what are the rules that the agents, that the actors inside it are following that might lead to it.
Well, I guess there's a few ways of sort of tackling that question. You're correct about the fact that often we try to do things from the top down and it's ineffective. So, what can we learn from bottom up strategies? And I think my particular interests have been about a particular kind of rule. So, there are many people who are interested in complex systems who are looking at laws and norms and social behaviors and what kinds of rules of behavior or institutional rules, those sorts of structural rules, are leading to structures that are able to preserve over time. And because I'm a designer and interested in making urban places, I haven't gone into public policy, I've gone into design. For me, it's been more about what are the physical characteristics of the city that allow it to manifest emergent qualities. And I'll give you an example. It's very far from the bazaar, but maybe kind of ties in a little bit with this, is that there's something called desire lines. If you've ever seen a park where you will have sidewalks that have been put down, placed by master planners from the top down, but then there'll be a shortcut running through the park between two locations that are actually meaningful locations. And there will be a path that has been traced through the grass that takes you from point A to point B. And that's a bottom up path. That is an emergent path. It has been manifested by many footfalls on the grass that have said, this is actually the direction that I want to walk. It may be that the sidewalk directions are also meaningful, but it could be that the sidewalk is not used at all. And we don't know that, whether the sidewalk is used or not used, because the pavement of the sidewalk has no way of recording information. Whereas there's something about the medium of the grass itself that is able to capture information and relay it and convey it. And then when other newcomers arrive at the park, they see that pathway and they know, well, this is going from someplace to someplace. And will probably find two meaningful destinations at either end of that particular pathway. So that is an example of the physical environment being able to, because of the way it is constituted, being able to capture, relay information in meaningful ways. And what I was interested in for my research in the Grand Bazaar was, is there something about the physical composition of the shops and the physical structures of the bazaar that allow it not just to persist over time? And there may be a whole host of reasons why it has persisted over time. There's cultural reasons, there's reasons that pertain to the fact that it is, at a very central location in Istanbul. So, historically, there's been patterns of movement that have continued to be there to gather flows of people in that particular environment. But it's not just that it's maintained its position there, it's that over time, you might have a district, for example, that is selling linen. And you'll see that district of linen, and maybe there'll be a cluster of 30 shops that are all selling linen in that particular area. But then they disappear and something else is there. But the something else isn't randomly distributed in the bazaar. My interest was that as uses and as merchandise shifted over time, that they would shift in ways where there would be these agglomerations of common goods in different sections. And so you would think that individual merchants would be there and that they would just randomly sell goods at any one of the 4,000 shops, so that you wouldn't be able to see a pattern. My interest was the fact that there was a pattern that was emerging and you could see common districts but no one had told anybody that you have to be there. No one had established that as a norm. And yet we could still see these patterns inscribed in space in the same way that you'd see the pattern of, common trails inscribed in grass. And I was very curious as to what is it about the structure of the urban characteristics of the bazaar that allowed that to happen. And then there's cultural aspects as well, which I sort of tie into, but it was kind of this interplay between the cultural knowledge that is being transitioned as well as the physical.
This is one reason why it's so much fun to talk to people who are close to urban design, is that a lot of us who are doing design of complex systems, I had to say complex again, but a lot of us who are doing design are designing things that are invisible. They might be, for instance, cultural norms that we hope are going to create good things. But in architecture, it's possible to look at something physical. It's possible to look at a thing. But I don't think that it is exclusively the domain of physical structures, right? Which is that although that's your specialty, we shouldn't necessarily assume that it's limited to physical structures.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that one of the things I'm interested in is how physical structures, in a way, help process information. And the information might be that cultural or social dimension that you're talking about. One of the ways I think about the Grand Bazaar as a kind of information processor, and that you have people who have their needs, right? And their needs may be, well, I'm a tourist, I want souvenirs. And another need might be that, well, I'm a resident living here and I want to find books that I know I can only find in particular regions of the bazaar because there are fine book collectors there. And that the bazaar is, in a way, acting as a kind of information processor to help both direct you to those goods that are of interest to you, to concentrate them in an area so that you don't have to spend a lot of energy finding what you need, that you can have a more focused search. And that as your needs shift over time, the kind of carrying capacity of the bazaar shifts. So if there's more of an influx of tourists, then those goods amplify themselves. And of course, this is just sort of basic supply and demand. What interests me about the bazaar is that retail is retail is retail. Every city is going to have a retail component to it. The question for me was that why is supply and demand able to recalibrate itself in an ongoing way in the Grand Bazaar? And to me, there was an aspect of the physical characteristics that had to do with a nimbleness and an ability to test different market niches and to test niches easily, but also to be able to find very, very distinct niches of offerings. So one of the things about complex adaptive systems is that these systems tend to have a power law distribution associated with them. And again, power laws, is as frightening a word as complexity. But sometimes, the easier way to think about it is the 80-20 rules. So we use 20% of our clothes 80% of the time, or 20% of the words in the English language are used 80% of the time. And so you might say that, well, 20% of the shops in the Grand Bazaar are actually responsible for 80% of the consumer demand. But what that leaves is the other 80%. And what's interesting about power law distributions is that it's not that those aren't useful, it's that they form this long tail. And one of the things that's interesting about new, particularly with the ease of information transfer right now, a lot of people have written about the fact that we're now able to access the long tail in much more straightforward ways. So if you have a very, very niche product, in the past, you would not necessarily be able to find the match between your niche product and your niche consumer. But now with information and the internet, you can match those two things together. So that's this sort of aspect of accessing the long tail, that there is someone out there who wants this, and you may actually be able to have enough of a market for your own good. And if there's 4,000 shops in the Grand Bazaar and you're selling one particular very niche thing, then there may be the carrying capacity to support that one good. Whereas when you think about retail, how we typically do it in North America, you're basically appealing not to the power law distribution, but to the bell curve. And so you're sort of thinking, well, most of people on average want these few things, and that's what we're going to provide. We're going to provide for the average. And so I'm interested in from an urban design standpoint of if you want to make cities that are less monotonous in terms of the kind of offerings, you want to somehow activate this possibility for people to find niche experiences, niche environments that at first glance don't feel like they would be profitable or viable because everyone is sort of trying to cater to the middle and cater to the masses.
So many things come to mind as you talk about this. One thing that comes to mind is the book, How Buildings Learn, which
Right.
is kind of how does the Grand Bazaar learn? And how does it reflect back and respond to the changing demand that are for things? So I want to talk about the components of that are. It also reminds me of Alex Komorowski is somebody who came on the show. He's been the product manager for some of the largest platforms in the industry.
Right.
So Chrome, Google Maps, all these different things. And he talks about putting a door in the jungle, which is it's just a shop door in the middle of no place that says, hey, I've got something good. And you see if people come. And if people come to that door, you want it to be a very low cost experiment.
Correct.
You just put a doorbell on a door. And if people ring the doorbell, there's some demand. And so what are the components of learning and how does the bazaar learn?
Okay, it's perfect. This is great. So I'm glad that you brought it to this idea of this. Do they come to the door? So one of the things that's really interesting about the urban structure of the bazaar is that the shops are actually really, really tiny. And not only are they tiny, but the module can actually even be subdivided further. So you can have almost like a half stall in the bazaar. And so that's a tiny, tiny door. And when you're a merchant on the street in the bazaar, because your shop is very, very tiny and because the exterior of the shop is covered, when your business is slow, you don't sit inside the shop waiting. You stand at the door of your shop, observing what's happening on the street in front of you. And the street in front of you, it's not like you can only see 2 or 3 shops. Because the street in front of you has such tiny shops, you cast your eyes around, you can see 20 little doors. And so you very quickly have a sense of, if I'm one of 20 little doors, what is the door that people are going in and out of versus my own? And so by being co-located with other merchants on the street, there is this kind of signaling. And I talked about the signaling in the grass as giving information about a pathway. Well, the signaling of the flows of consumers that you see moving in and out of the neighboring shops is something that is giving you information on the street about what are they doing that I'm not doing, that I could potentially be doing more of. And then the other piece of that is that not only do you have that information where you can see, gee, they're carrying these kinds of carpets or these kinds of leather jackets, and I'm not. Not only can you see that, but you can also, you have a very small inventory, you have a very small footprint. And so it's very easy to pivot. And so in terms of this nimble testing, you can pivot quickly. And if you're successful, then you can grow. Because then you can say, well, someone else has gone out of business a few doors down, and I can acquire that and expand and do something else. And this is how the districts begin to grow in what I would say is a very close equilibrium with what the actual carrying capacity is of a particular good, because shops can pivot quickly and people have an incentive to pivot quickly if something isn't working. They want to be successful, and they have these signals that their neighbors, and the signals they're seeing are not distorted signals. So, for example, in North America, we'll have shops that might be successful because the parent company is actually subsidizing their success. And so what might look like success from the outside is actually a signal that's been distorted. Whereas when you're actually seeing the footfalls in front of you and the people who are either leaving with bags or not leaving with bags, that's another kind of, the fidelity of the signal, I would say, is very high. The other component, in addition to this sort of, this tacit observation on the street, is that there are a number of sort of gathering nodes in the bazaar. And some of them are, the local coffee area or the local area where people go to the barber shop. And so in addition to the shops, there's a little bit of background infrastructure that exists there. And this is where you get the local gossip about what's going well, who's doing well, who's going out of business, who's thriving. And that provides additional information on the street in ways that allow you to kind of calibrate your own business model.
Are those hubs? There's a language that goes with this, which is I want to
Mhm.
make sure that we get all of the components. There's nodes, there's agents, there's hubs. What are nodes?
This is interesting. When I was writing about the Grand Bazaar, I was sort of trying to relate it to a kind of language that urban designers would be familiar with. And so at the time when I was working on my article on the Grand Bazaar, which was a part of my PhD thesis, I was concerned that people wouldn't be able to relate to complexity theory very easily. But there's an important urban theorist, Kevin Lynch, and Kevin Lynch talks about edges and he talks about nodes and he talks about landmarks. And so I thought, well, maybe one way to anchor some of these concepts for an urban audience would be to meld these languages together. And so I wanted to make a distinction between nodes and hubs, between sort of larger gathering areas, for example, mosques, which are really central gathering areas, to more micro meeting areas, and that they're operating really at different scales in terms of their importance to whether this is broader communities from different areas of the bazaar who are getting together or more localized communities. And so really that is the distinction between thinking about hubs and thinking about nodes. And in all honesty, in some ways, that language isn't so significant to me because I think different theorists will sort of talk about that in different ways. There's another group called evolutionary economic geographers. And these are people who are interested in similar dynamics to what I'm interested in complexity, but they're looking at it more at the regional scale. So why do we have a cluster called Silicon Valley, right, that attracts a particular kind of thinker and worker? And how do geographical constraints cause those sorts of areas to emerge? And they talk about there being these areas where you have both local buzz and global pipelines in the same sort of region. You can be tapped into what's happening at a global scale, but you're also in part in these micro discussions, and that you sort of need both because otherwise you're missing the full picture.
I'm fascinated in them. I'm going to have to research them further. You're right. The urban planning language of Lynch is very structure based or form based. And a lot of what you're looking at is much more function based. And
Mhm.
some of those structures may be byproducts of functional systems, right?
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And I think that's really the inversion that I was interested in is to think probably less about, you know, when you think about a network and you think about nodes that are important in a network. So if you think about the World Wide Web and you think about Wikipedia as a node that has become important, it's become important not because someone said from a master planning perspective on the internet, Wikipedia shall be an important hub on the web. It really emerged from the bottom up. And so I think one of the errors that planners have made is that they look at successful cities and then they say, oh, well, look, it's this successful city. It's got a nice clock tower in the middle, and that is a landmark and, you know, a kind of a node for people to get together. So if we make this landmark, then we're going to have a successful city, or it will look like what a successful city looks like. And what I've been really interested in is what are the underlying dynamics that cause those kinds of nodes or hubs to actually appear organically rather than being contrived from the top down. So, how do flows actually converge in a real way? What are the mechanisms by which that happens? And, you know, some of that they emerge organically because they're coming at the confluence of routes of people or money or transport or infrastructure. And that is a much more organic way of thinking about how we mark territories of distinction.
There's these different flows going around in the bazaar. And
Mhm.
one of them is the flow of customers. One of them is the flow of money. One of them is the flow of information and the capture of information in different ways. Oh, that shop survived. I'll put a shop just like it next to it because that one seems to be, I can see that it's doing well. I think it's very easy for us to anchor on money because it's so visible. I'm
Mhm.
wondering if we've got the information flow. There was one story you told in your paper on the Grand Bazaar, which was there was a person went and said, I want to buy 400 carpets. I want to buy 400 rugs. And the seller of those rugs said, look, that's 6 months of supply for me. If I sell you those carpets, I'm going to lose 400 relationships. If I sell them one at a time, I'm going to get 400 relationships. If I sell you 400 right now, I'm going to make the same amount of money, but I won't get that. And so what are the other flows, the less visible flows?
Thank you for reminding me of that story. It was a striking sort of example of how we value things. So, yes, I'll agree with you that I think money is a very interesting signal. It's a signal of, I think money is information in many ways. And I think it's a signal of value. And I've been sort of fascinated with, I think if I had another lifetime to go back to university, I would study economics at this point, because I'm really, really interested about how money serves as a signal of value and that we should honor that it's a signal of value as opposed to just, I mean, a lot of criticism is critical of capitalist structures, which I can understand as well, because there's a lot of downsides to it. But I think that it's also important to recognize the fact that where money is accruing is actually giving us quite a lot of information about how energy and resources can be deployed. So I'm very interested in money. In terms of other sources of flows, I think that creative capital, that is a huge component of it as well. So when, some of the customs that take place in the bazaar are that people sit and drink tea. And they really sit and drink tea. And there's also very slow seasons of the bazaar. And again, this has probably been amplified over time because now many more shops in the bazaar are reliant on the tourist seasons. And so you have a downside during the winter months when it's quite quiet, but people are still manning their stores, but they have a chance to really sit and drink tea. And while they're sitting and drinking tea, they're building these, tea is a social lubricant within the society. It's an inexpensive drink. And it's really something that's meant to foster relationships. So I think there's a lot of knowledge transfer that happens within that. I think there's also, I remember reading about or speaking to an individual that was talking about getting loans in the bazaar, that it's much, much, much easier there to have credit because you're so known by the community around you that anyone will be able to tell, the banking industry whether you're a good risk or not a good risk. And so it's easy to, if you're going to be starting a new venture and you want to change the produce that you are selling, to be able to do those kinds of shifts. Think in terms of getting information about suppliers. You're building a lot of trust, and there's a sense of a rising tide lifts all boats, as opposed to it being a fierce competitor sort of environment of, well, we must defeat the other person in order to take more of a share. The earlier story about I could sell everything to you or I could distribute what you want to buy between myself and the merchants adjacent to me, which will help all of us. Some of that has got a bit of a historic root in the guild system, and a bit of that is carried on. And I think some of that also has to do just with the way the culture in Turkey in some of these settings is just still operating, and that social capital is important, that it matters to make a living, but what you're doing beyond making a living in terms of how you're making that living and the relationships that you have while you're making that living is also something that is seen that is really of value there. And unfortunately, I think we lose that too much in the context that we're living in.
It's very interesting. You could have just been right now talking about venture capital in Silicon Valley and the way it works, which is all these storefronts, all these relationships. Who's a good risk, who isn't? Having the ability to make low risk investments. I mean, to us, to normal people, they'd be crazy risky because they're high dollar investments. But to venture capitalists, they're not. Let's test a lot of ideas in the marketplace. We're going to place smart bets and we're going to see where they go. If I'm a planner, and by the way, my background for many years was as a business architect. And what business architects do is they are the business equivalent of urban planners. So I'm looking at a single company and I need to plan a different future for it. And what's a planner to do? Because I'm starting to learn helplessness here, which is how does one take information about this and enable a thriving system?
It's great that you relate it to the idea of venture capitalists who say, I'm going to take small risks in a lot of different places. I was interested in the Grand Bazaar as an example of a complex adaptive system, but I looked at many different, and I've continued to look at many different complex adaptive systems and how that might play out in the urban realm, because I'm not prepared to be helpless. And I think there is still a role for architects and designers. I just think it's a different kind of role where it's no longer about planning the object and, trying to make nice or compose nice looking things, but to really try to understand what it is that we're structuring. And I think this idea of enabling quick tests is something that I'm quite fascinated by. So another part of my research has looked at tactical urban approaches. And this is, they're called light, quick, cheap, LQC. And the idea is rather than building something permanent in the environment, let's do a lot of little tests. And let's do tests that cost a couple of $100, $500, $1,000. Because, what we tend to do is before we do build a project, first of all, we might just go ahead and build it and assume that the designer or the developer knows what they're doing or the city planner knows what they're doing. The other thing we sometimes do is we ask people to forecast. So we have community consultations, or we'll hire a consultant and we'll say, so what do you think if we build this park, will they come? And then they try to find data and they try to analyze movement patterns and they try to figure out, and you spend $50,000 on a report to tell you, yes, they'll come, or maybe they'll come, or no, they won't come. But instead of spending $50,000 on that report, you could spend $1,000 with some movable park infrastructure that you allow to be a pop-up park for a weekend. And then you can test 20 different sites over 20 different weekends and see, well, where does this seem to have success? And so there's this approach of tactical urbanism that has tried to really embrace this notion of, well, maybe we don't know everything, but then how can we tactically learn and still learn from our mistakes, learn from our successes? And again, this has to do with what are the physical components of the city that have this agility to learn. So the Grand Bazaar has this agility in terms of the smallness of the unit and the ability to carry signals easily where those signals are visible on the street. But there's also, in today's world, we can use more mobile infrastructures. We can use, food trucks are a great example of something that is able to test different locations and figure out, is this a good location for my business or is this not a good location? Because you're replacing the information on the street with the information of testing different streets, right? And so I think that complexity can be deployed in a multitude of different ways, but there are some common principles that I think tie different complexity tactics to one another, whether we're talking about a bazaar that's been there for 5 centuries or whether we're talking about new smart Internet of Things components. I can give you another example, which is a nice thought experiment for me that probably isn't so technologically feasible today, but maybe within 5-10 years would be more so. If I'm a planner for a park and I know that I'm going to put 100 benches in a park, the top-down planner would say, well, I'm going to compose where these benches can be, and we'll see where people sit. But once I set them down on the ground, they're probably just going to sit there, and I probably won't monitor it after the fact to see which park benches are crowded and which park benches stay empty. If I think of the park bench as being an agent in a complex system, I can say to myself, what flow is that park bench interested in? So one helpful way I've started to think about complex system is often you think about people as being the agents in the complex system, but I like to flip it. So I like to think, okay, a park bench, what is its raison d'etre, right? What does it want to be? It wants to hold people. It wants to have people sitting on it, and then it's fulfilling its destiny. A park bench that is sitting empty is not fulfilling its destiny. So if you were to enable every park bench with a sensor, and then if you were able to give it some lovely autonomous mobility, then park benches could operate as swarm park benches. And they could signal to one another, I am full, I am empty. And park benches that are consistently full, other park benches may start to gravitate towards that region of the park, and ones that are empty can abandon their empty locations. And as a complex system, the park benches could eventually self-organize to an optimum equilibrium where every park bench, on average, is sat on an equal amount of time. Because if it's not being sat on adjacent to its neighbors, if it has less carrying potential than its neighbors, it will relocate itself until it achieves equilibrium. And this is the way a complex system works. It's very simple rules. The park bench does not have to be smart. It just has to say, am I more or less occupied than my surrounding neighbors, and shift accordingly. And then there's a bit of, there's other dynamics. There's a bit of random search you have to throw in there as well to make sure that you're not locked into a weaker equilibrium. But those sorts of things we can sort of apply in multiple domains.
It's very related. So, as an idea for people who are running businesses, I remember hearing Intuit talk about a story. They don't have a park, they have a website. And in their website, well, it's close. It's close. It's more like the bazaar than it is like the benches. But what they said is, look, we think we have a good idea for a product. Let's not build the product and then see if people want it. They put a link on a page and said, hey, do you want this product? And see how many people click on it. 100,000 people clicked on it, but there was no product. It just said error 404 or whatever. So they said, great. If we can convert X% of those to sales, then this product is worth doing. So then they put a pay page where you actually could pay for it. They still didn't have a product, but they were testing to see how many people would pay for it. And then 10% were clicking through to actually pay that amount. And they could even test the price level that people were willing to pay, because they get a little randomness in the prices and see what people clicked on. And then they said, yeah, this is worth doing. And they built the product to meet that demand. And so the idea of agility and testing in situ, which I think is super important, which is that the context of the test is so important to whether or not that test makes sense.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And actually, and I mean, this for me was also really important in my own research work. There are a lot of people who are interested in complex systems and planning, and what they're doing is computational modeling. And so they're simulating an environment, and they're, giving the agents in the computer model simple rules, and they're watching patterns emerge. And then they're talking about how this is predictive in some way, because they try to make the models have a lot of fidelity with the real world. I think the work is interesting, but I'm much more interested in, let's not model cities as complex systems. Let's make systems where they actually are a computational information processing device. How can we make cities information processors? And going back to the Grand Bazaar, from my thinking, that environment is actually doing information processing. And it keeps on changing the variables and changing the parameters of what each store offers until it tunes the right calibration with what the consumer demand is for those particular goods. And so the more we can think about what gives us the agility to keep on testing, and to keep on testing, as you say, not by committing to a whole lot of product development, but a very, very light touch test gives us that agility, which I think is so important right now because things are transforming so fast all the time. I mean, it's funny that one of my examples is something that's been around for 500 years, but really the world that we're living in today is all about this incredible pace of change. And so anything that you're forecasting to be stable moving forward is necessarily going to be able to change. So how can we inherently build in that adaptive capacity. And that is one thing that I've been really, really interested in complex systems thinking, is that do the agents in the system have enough degrees of freedom where they have adaptive capacity? If I build something that can only be deployed in one way, then I'm limiting what it can do 10 months from now, 10 years from now, in terms of the environment it's finding itself with, the context it's finding itself within. So I'm much less interested in optimizing for a current situation and much more interested in figuring out how can I deploy something which I don't know how it's ultimately going to manifest itself, but has an inherent designed capacity to manifest itself in different ways. And then that changes your design problem considerably.
I just had a really big idea. And I've been close to this idea for a while, but it wasn't until you just were talking about it that it really crystallized for me, which is that top-down control has a tendency to have a hierarchy. And the hierarchy is essentially passing commands down. And those demands, for instance, could be zoning, where we're going to say the zones, and that becomes, I actually like zoning, but I can see where it can become over-controlling. But I've argued for a while that we should be flipping our org charts and that management should show up at the bottom and that teams and individual contributors should show up at the top. But there is still potentially a hierarchy of enablement. And I'll give you an example from California. Why Silicon Valley? Well, one of the reasons why Silicon Valley is because one of the constraints was lifted, which is non-compete clauses. So non-compete clauses said that employees couldn't go from one competitor to another for 3 years. Well, they're illegal in California. And so you can't have non-compete clauses. And that's one of the things where what you're doing is you're allowing agents to act in ways that those agents are unable to act in other parts of the country.
Yeah.
So you can still have sort of a hierarchy of enablement as opposed to a hierarchy of control. And the most base level of it, enablement, is just the broadest effect. It's going to affect a whole company. But there's an interesting idea of what is the appropriate level of control and what is the appropriate level of freedom. I don't know if that hierarchy is real, but I'm liking the idea.
When I start talking about my work, sometimes people say, well, you can't just have a free-for-all. And I mean, this isn't intending to suggest that either. So there is a level of structure that's going into the system. But the system, it has a kind of a structured boundary still about what it can and cannot do. And I mean, in complexity theory, they sort of talk about this as, well, you could talk about it as degrees of freedom or your phase space, right? What are some allowable acts for something to be? Another example I can give is, and I've spent time in the Netherlands for my PhD, but in Amsterdam, we have the canal houses, and these are these very narrow, tall houses. And, they were built originally as residence and warehouses. And over time, they keep evolving. But the way the structure is very apparent. I mean, there are these houses, they've got a sort of set of urban rules, I suppose you could say, in terms of their overall appearance. They all have the same setback on the street, and they all have similar kind of arrays of windows and similar floor heights. But the way those can be deployed are various. So you will have sometimes each individual floor is an individual entity. It might be a restaurant on the lowest floor and a business on the next floor, and then the next 3 floors might be an apartment that are all 3 floors up. So the individual components of that built fabric can be either broken down as a single unit being a floor, or a single unit being the entire building, or a single unit being the entire block, because sometimes what you'll do is you'll get aggregates of the entire block operating as one business or one entity. So you have quite a bit of liberty to sort of deploy an identical building component across different neighborhoods. The general morphology of the Amsterdam canal house is the same wherever you're going, but it's deployed in very, very different ways. And so I'm interested in figuring out structures that allow for not a sense of a free-for-all, because I don't think we would like Amsterdam if it was just a hodgepodge of everything and anything, but that has a level of both control and freedom within that control to deploy the urban assets in different ways.
And I can see that operating in a lot of different ways. In laws, for instance, which is that laws are established so that we can trust, in part, so that we have systems that enable us to trust each other,
Right.
because we know that
Right.
we have these structures that are going to support trust, and trust is such an important part of flow.
Well, and even coming back to, the earlier examples of complex systems where I talked about very simple rules guiding starlings and very simple rules guiding ants that form trails. But starlings don't form trails and ants don't form murmurations, right? You still have whatever is emerging from the agent. The structure that emerges from the agent is a meaningful structure in terms of what that particular agent needs to do. And I think that is far from being a free for all. It's figuring out what are the meaningful rules in the system that then guide us towards fit overall outcomes and results.
I could talk about this all day, by the way, all day long.
How could I?
And right, a career even. I want to tell you stories about swimming in schools of fish, which I've done a lot. I've swim in schools of anchovies and use them as a sensing organism to know where the predators are. Because when you're in the middle of a school of anchovies or sardines, they're responding to what's at the edge. And so you actually know things.
So they're an information processor.
They are an information processor, and then this is a cross-species symbiosis where I'm using them to catch their predators. So the question I often ask at the end of our shows is one I didn't prepare you for at all, which is, what do you hire your job to do for you?
It's a really interesting question. So, I'm in academia now, and of course, it's a huge privilege to be able to spend time thinking about starlings and and ants. There are not many employment areas where I would have the liberty to be able to pursue these very strange trajectories of thought that I've had for years. And then, oh my goodness, someone actually pays me to do this and to think about it. It's really delightful from that perspective that I have the opportunity to pursue that in terms of my research. I'm now more in leadership, which has meant that my research is probably slowing down a little bit compared to my other academic responsibilities. But I think that being in a leadership role now, I really, really am enjoying having the agency granted to just be able to make processes run smoother. When you're working for a long time in an area, you see things around you and you think, oh, I wish this weren't that way, or why can't we do something? And so smoothing that pathway is really, really satisfying for me, to feel like I've been granted agency to try to solve problems, to smooth pathways for other people, to make their trajectory smoother, easier than parts of mine have been. I find that extremely satisfying. In some ways, it's a form of giving back, I guess, to my colleagues and to my community and to my students. And I'm really, really enjoying this phase of my career.
It will be interesting to see how you apply controls versus enablement in that, right? Because you're facing this situation, which is you're enabling an ecosystem, an academic ecosystem.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that'll be really interesting. I mean, I suppose I've thought about this a lot, that there's so many areas where CAS thinking, it can be applied. And certainly there's a lot of individuals I've met at conferences who are interested in it, in the business models and in managerial success. And so whether I'm able to take my knowledge from thinking about it spatially and think about it now from this a more leadership perspective will be, I think, a very cool challenge, cool next step for me. And I'm enjoying it. I'm enjoying it. Certainly, I like pulling different threads together in a network and seeing how seemingly disparate things can go together and create novel synergies. And I'm interested in trying to find those synergies.
What does your job cost you?
Oh, that's an interesting question. What does my job cost me? My dad worked till he was 88. He could have retired a lot earlier. And it's an interesting question because as I get older and start to think more about what I want to do in retirement, that question comes up. Well, what would it cost me to retire versus to keep working? Because I love solving problems. And having a job to go to every day is a very nice commitment device that causes you to do that. I love travel. And so I think that if I weren't working, I would probably be traveling more. I've done a lot of travel in my life. And one of the nice things about being an academic is that, you have your 9-month academic year, and then the summers, there's a lot more flexibility with where you can physically be. So exploring the world is something that's always been very important to me. So that, there is a bit of a cost there, although I feel like it's being supplemented in many ways because of how much I'm enjoying the region that I'm living in now, too.
Where can people learn more about you and your work?
If you look me up on Google Scholar, you can see links to my articles. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Academia EDU. So there's, if you Google Sharon Wohl and Urban, then you will get links to a whole range of papers. And the Grand Bazaar is but one of many examples of work where I've really tried to think about contemporary applications of complexity thinking, given the Internet of Things as well.
Thank you very much for coming on the show today.
Oh, you're very welcome. It was just such a lovely conversation. I really appreciate you inviting me. This has been wonderful, Dart. Thank you.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of Work for Humans. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. And share the show with one person you think would get value from it. Believe it or not, this really helps us grow the show and reach more people who want to build the kind of work that people really want. As always, thank you to my producer, Jason Ames at Ninth Path Audio, for his insights into content and his high standard for quality. Final note, the opinions shared here are my own and not the views of Google or Cisco Systems. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.